Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. A potential 5% wealth tax could cost California's 246 billionaires as much as $13 billion each. And in light of this, several billionaire residents have already moved out of the state. How much will people like Mark Zuckerberg, Kim Kardashian, and LeBron James owe if this billionaire tax takes effect? Joining us to answer this question and more is Chase Peterson Withorn, a Forbes senior editor who is responsible for the Forbes 400 and the list of the world's billionaires. Chase, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's start with a few establishing facts. What is this proposed billionaire tax? What does it entail, and when would it take effect?
Yeah, so the proposal is a 5% tax on virtually all of the wealth held by the resident billionaires of California. So it's not an income tax where, you're taxing just the income that these billionaires realize. A lot of billionaires don't realize a lot of income. Most of their net worth is, tied up in the assets that they own, the companies they founded or inherited, their yachts and their art collections and all that stuff. This tax is designed to tax all of that stuff. So whether you sell it or not, you owe 5% on your yacht. You owe 5% on, your startup shares or your publicly traded stock. And so the idea is that all billionaires that are residents of California as of the beginning of this year, January 1, will be taxed 5% based on the value of all of their holdings as of December 31st of 2026.
And to be clear, this is just a proposal, correct? It's not even a guaranteed ballot measure?
Yeah, that's right. They still need to collect, something like 900,000 signatures to even get on the ballot. Then it has to be approved by California voters. And then it would have to make it through any legal challenges that it might face. And you can imagine that the legal challenges will be substantial if it makes it all the way to being passed. You have very wealthy people who have a lot of money and a lot of incentive, to fight this. And you're already seeing some billionaires, looking for ways to fight it.
And you talk about opposition to this proposal. California Governor Gavin Newsom told the New York Times, quote, "This will be defeated. There's no question in my mind. I'll do what I have to protect the state." So that is a clear indication that this is not an idea he's behind. Who are the people behind it?
Yeah, so, it's a healthcare union that represents, I think, something like 120,000, healthcare workers primarily in California. They worked with some professors to put this proposal together. And I have to say, looking through the language of the bill, it's certainly written in a way that understands billionaires' holdings and really tries to head off any potential loopholes to get around paying the 5%. So, it exempts a couple of things. It exempts, their real estate, their personal real estate. But that's like kind of pretty much it. Everything else is pretty much, accounted for. And then there's all kinds of, rules and provisions of the bill that, try to get around, common loopholes in the current tax system to try to make these billionaires pay. And yeah, you're right. There's been a lot of opposition from billionaires and even from, some Democrats in the state like Gavin Newsom, who are just very concerned that it's going to, push these very wealthy people and their companies away.
Now, California, by Forbes accounting, has more billionaire residents than any state in the U.S. at present. Who has relocated already? Have any individuals moved out of California and into Florida, Nevada, New York, any other state?
Yeah, so, there's around 250 billionaires in California by our count. They're worth more than $2 trillion. And, they have created or still run companies that, are trillions and trillions of dollars in value. And you've already seen billionaires, tons of billionaires threatening to leave, lots of billionaires threatening to leave. And, you have some examples of prominent billionaires who have left or who have tried to leave. One of them, maybe the most notable, is Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, who spent something like $173 million buying a couple mansions in Miami just ahead of the deadline. To try to sort of move out of California. And another example of that is this auto loan billionaire, Don Hankey, who lived in California for all 82 years of his life. Some news broke that somebody had paid a record $21 million for a penthouse in the Las Vegas area. And Don Hankey told me that he was the one who bought it. And the reason he bought it is he needed to move out of the state. He's, potentially on the hook for a $400 million tax. So a $21 million apartment is, if it can save him $400 million in taxes, the math sort of adds up.
It's really a drop in the bucket. And I just want to follow up on something you said about personal wealth versus, you mentioned their companies. So does company revenue, company valuation, AUMs for any VC portfolios factor into this, or is this entirely on the personal side?
Yeah, no, it is. So to be clear, it's a tax on it is intended to be only for billionaires, people with a net worth of at least $1 billion as of December 31st, 2026, who live in California as of, January 1st, 2026. And it's a tax on all of their holdings. So, the companies don't get taxed. Google isn't, going to face a tax here. But if you are a billionaire and you own Google stock, your Google stock will be taxed. And that's liquid investments like, public company stock or cash accounts or portfolios of bonds. But it also is if you're a venture capitalist and you have a bunch of illiquid wealth that's sitting in, VC funds or private equity funds or, commercial real estate seems like it would still count. All of that stuff you're going to owe 5% of. If you have a startup that you've just raised a few series of, funding, but you don't have any liquidity, it's just on paper, this company is worth 10 billion and you own 1% of it, you own 10% of it. You still owe 5% on the $1 billion in value that you have there, and you've got to come up with a way to pay it, under this tax, which is very different from, the way taxes usually work in the United States.
So let's dig into some specific names and exactly what this proposal would mean for them. And let's start with NVIDIA's Jensen Huang. How much is he worth? Has he said anything about the tax, and how much would he owe?
Yeah, Jensen Huang is a really interesting example. He is probably so far the only billionaire who has come out not in support of the tax, but has said publicly, I won't fight the tax. And I think what he said was, we choose to live in Silicon Valley, so whatever taxes I pay, so be it. I'm perfectly fine with it. And I guess it sounds like that's an easy thing to say because he's worth about $160 billion. So he certainly has the money to spare. But if you actually look at how much money he would owe, under this proposal, it's something like $8 billion. So it's pretty interesting to see him say he's willing to pay $8 billion to live in California. But he's really maybe the only voice that's come out and said, yeah, I'm fine with it. So yeah, he's the founder of NVIDIA. And, maybe his background is part of why he's okay with it too. He was born in Taiwan. He, immigrated to the United States. He got a master's degree at Stanford. And he sort of sketched out the idea for NVIDIA, this huge company now, the biggest, hottest AI darling in the world, from a booth in a Denny's restaurant in San Jose. And he had worked at Denny's, when he first immigrated to the United States also. So, he has an interesting background and maybe an interesting perspective on all of this stuff. And so, maybe that's why he's really the only billionaire who's come out and said, yeah, I'll pay whatever they say I need to.
We shouldn't speculate too much, but you mentioned NVIDIA's whopping success, and I do wonder if part of his commentary is grounded in confidence for the financial performance of his company in 2026 and beyond. Yeah,
it definitely might be.
Larry Page, you mentioned him earlier, but let's dig into the numbers. How much is he worth and how much would he owe? And would he still owe it given some of the real estate transactions you reported on earlier this year?
That's a great question. So under the proposed California billionaires tax, no person would pay more money than Larry Page if he's a California resident. He's worth about $268 billion. He would owe something like $13.4 billion if he is indeed a California resident and this bill passes. Really a very staggering number. He grew up in Michigan. He moved to California to study at Stanford. Very famously co-founded Google out of a Menlo Park garage in 1998 and has been sort of a California billionaire ever since. Ahead of this tax, being after it was proposed, ahead of the deadline, he did spend $173 million on a couple mansions in Miami and sort of looks like he's moving to Florida. If that is true, he might save himself something like $13.4 billion. But the law is really interesting in that, it does say that real estate that you acquire to get around the law doesn't count. And California has historically been pretty aggressive in going after people that they believe are California residents, even if they claim that they're not. And so, it will be interesting to see, among all the legal challenges that might play out if the bill passes, it would be interesting to see if Larry Page's, move actually is successful or not. Because, it's pretty clear he spent a lot of money to move to Miami right before the deadline. And, the way they drafted the law, their position would be that doesn't count. I'm sure Larry Page's position would be that does count. And he's probably willing to pay about up to $13.3 billion or so fighting it.
It brings up an interesting existential question, which is, what is a person's home? What is a person's location? We run into trouble with this with the Power Women list. If someone reports to a company headquartered in one locality but lives somewhere else, what do we list as their location? If he hasn't changed his driver's license, his political voter registration, it opens up a ton of questions. But let's move on to Mark Zuckerberg. Has he said anything about this?
Yeah, so, Zuckerberg would also owe a tremendous amount of money. So I think there are about a dozen billionaires by our math that would owe over $1 billion in tax if the bill passes. Mark Zuckerberg is certainly one of them. He's worth $222 billion or so. He'd owe something like $11 billion. And, he started Facebook not in California. He, famously started Facebook out of his Harvard dorm in Boston, but he moved it to Silicon Valley really in the early days, back in 2004. And, Meta, Facebook's parent company, has been a California company ever since. They've acquired a bunch of other California companies too. He's given a lot of money to, California causes. He's given $600 million to the, University of California system, $75 million to San Francisco General Hospital. He owns all this real estate. He has real estate in Lake Tahoe, real estate in San Francisco. So he's very much, a California billionaire right now. But he does own a lot of land in California, a bunch of property there, properties throughout the United States. So it will be interesting to see, if he tries to move too, and if he comes out in support or against the bill, will be interesting to see. But, there's $11 billion. There are 11 billion reasons for him to, maybe be not such a fan of the bill.
This next person could potentially owe a little bit less, Peter Thiel, and yet he's still over the $1 billion mark in terms of your calculations. What's his story?
Yeah, Peter Thiel, came to California in the 70s with his family. He went to Stanford. He went to Stanford Law School, and he has backed a bunch of, really notable California companies. He's venture capitalist, backed Facebook, PayPal, Palantir. He, years ago got New Zealand citizenship, very famously, and I think has always been, mindful of taxes and mindful of what his citizenship is and what his, domicile is. So maybe unsurprisingly, he would owe something like $1.5 billion under this bill. Unsurprisingly, Thiel is not a fan of it, and he has already put $3 million into a political committee that's looking to oppose the bill. So came out very strong, very early with, a large check to try to oppose it. And I would imagine there's more money where that came from.
Going back to the story of Google, we have Sergey Brin. He would potentially owe quite a bit. What did you find on him?
Yeah, if you look at the top 5 biggest potential payers under this bill, as it stands right now, based on net worths right now, and assuming that they're all California residents when, if the bill passes, 3 of them are from Google. So one is Larry Page, but his Google co-founder, Sergey Brin, is right behind him. He would owe something like $12.4 billion. He's just a little bit less wealthy than Larry Page. And it's a similar story. He co-founded Google out of, the garage in Menlo Park. He owns properties in LA, owns properties in Malibu. He's been trying to cut ties with the state, just like Larry Page. They moved a bunch of corporate entities to Nevada and to Delaware and places like that. And those two Google guys could owe something like $25 billion. And then the longtime former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, would be the 5th highest payer by our math. He would owe something like $1.8 billion. So Google's executives would be particularly hit hard by this bill.
Talking about other famous California residents, I think of George Lucas. He feels like such an iconic California resident. Would he owe a lot of money if this were to pass?
Yeah, George Lucas would owe something like $250 million by our calculations. His net worth is above $5 billion. And you're right, he's a famous example of a California billionaire, really kind of a quintessential California story. He grew up in Modesto. He went to USC. He got into Hollywood, started Lucasfilms, created Star Wars. Now he has his very famous Skywalker Ranch in Marin County, where there's all kinds of Hollywood production is sort of done up there. He has mansions in Carpinteria, mansions in Los Angeles. Just a really classic California billionaire. And by the math of this bill, the cost of that would be something like $250 million to him.
Another famous name from the world of entertainment, Oprah. Mm-hmm. How much did you calculate that she could potentially owe under this bill?
Yeah, so Oprah's a really interesting one because she is very famously a California billionaire. She has a home that she built a couple decades ago there called the Promised Land. She also owns a huge property in Hawaii. She owns property in Chicago. It's a little bit unclear where her primary residence is. And so if she is a Chicago resident, or a Hawaii resident, Oprah will definitely be happy about that. That will definitely be very beneficial to her. But if Oprah is not, then she's going to be hit pretty hard by the tax. And I want to say she would owe something like $150 million. So, not chump change at all.
I think our viewers would be interested to know that Kim Kardashian, worth $1.9 billion, has a little bit of a lower potential tax bill under this proposal. What did you calculate there?
Yeah, Kim Kardashian would owe something like $90 million based on her current net worth. Much of her fortune is tied up in Skims, which is definitely an illiquid asset. They've raised a bunch of money, but she's certainly raked in a lot of cash over the years from Keeping Up with the Kardashians and now the Kardashians and all of her business ventures. But Skims is what really put Kim Kardashian on the billionaires list. And she definitely fits, for all of the fame and all of the wealth, she definitely fits pretty well in the category of billionaires who have much of their wealth tied up in illiquid assets. And so how she would pay the $90 million bill, maybe she has the cash, but maybe she has to sell some of her skim stake.
While we stay in the realm of Hollywood, I have to confess, I forget that Steven Spielberg is among America's richest people. How much is he worth, and what would that mean if this bill comes to pass?
Yeah, Steven Spielberg is worth about $7 billion, which means he would owe something like $350 million under this tax plan. He moved to California for college. He went to California State at Long Beach. And he created a couple big movie studios that are, famously California studios, Amblin Entertainment and DreamWorks. And now he lives in Pacific Palisades. So it would be a big bill for Spielberg.
Now, Chase, what about Reid Hoffman? He's another name that we've been following for quite some time.
Yeah, Reid Hoffman is the founder of LinkedIn. He is worth something like $2.5 billion. And he would owe something like $125 million under this plan. And he's an interesting one because, he's a pretty famously liberal donor and probably is politically aligned with, a lot of the people who are proponents of this bill. But it would be interesting to see if, he feels similar to Gavin Newsom, that this is maybe not the best way to fill this budget shortfall.
I don't want to group people together who have different businesses, but I do feel like when we as a society talk about tech bros, we're talking about a few specific people like Jack Dorsey, Sam Altman, Sean Parker. Did you look at any of those gentlemen and what they could potentially owe the California government?
Yeah, they would owe a pretty hefty amount. I want to say you're getting close to half of something like 500 million maybe between the three of them. Sean Parker, famously was the wonderkin behind Napster. He moved to California when he became the first president of Facebook in 2004. And he would owe something like 150 million under this plan. Sam Altman, obviously one of the biggest names in the tech world or in the world, at all today. Ran Y Combinator for a long time. Now, the face behind OpenAI and probably more than anybody besides maybe Jensen Huang, or maybe up in the same category as Jensen Huang, is sort of the face of the AI revolution. He would owe something like 110 million. And then Jack Dorsey, co-founded Twitter, co-founded Square, which is now Block, and he would owe like 250 million, I think, something like that, under this bill.
Now, Chase, in your analysis, you did look at some of the wealthier names in the world of sports, and Magic Johnson showed up in your story that was published earlier this month. How much is he worth, and what's the bill that he could be looking at?
So Magic Johnson, longtime LA Lakers great, one of the great NBA players of all time. He really made his money in California, but not as a Los Angeles Laker. He really made it after he left the team. His company is based in Beverly Hills. He's invested in a bunch of other sports franchises, including the LA Dodgers. He has a big insurance company and is, just hustled his way onto the billionaires list. He's worth $1.5 billion by our account, which means he would owe something like $75 million under the bill.
Former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, is on your list. I imagine he has strong feelings about this.
Yeah, I don't think we've really heard from the governor so much yet, but the bill is the taxes are coming for him too, just like anybody else. So, he was the governor of California from 2003 to 2011. He raised the minimum wage. He proposed universal health care. He was a Republican governor that, maybe wasn't as super neatly categorized into like modern left versus right politics. But he would owe something like 60 million under this. He's worth $1.2 billion. He has a huge mansion in LA that wouldn't be taxed, but also has a bunch of commercial real estate holdings that, we think probably would be, and has just earned a lot of money over the years as a bodybuilder, as an actor, and as a businessman.
And as we move to our final two names, these are relatively newer billionaires compared to folks like Mark Zuckerberg, but LeBron James, beloved athlete. I don't know how much he would love if this proposal comes to fruition. What's he looking at?
Yeah, LeBron is famously frugal and pretty famously trying to save up as much money as he can to, eventually buy control of an NBA team. At least that's the pretty wide speculation. But, this is a guy who famously won't pay for Spotify premium and won't pay for data roaming when he's vacationing on, yachts in the Mediterranean. So I can't imagine that paying a $60 million tax bill would be high on his priority list or list of things that, he would like doing. But, maybe he feels like Jensen Huang that, he's just privileged to live in California. Certainly somebody who has chosen to move to the state, moved to the Los Angeles Lakers a number of years ago and, has decided to stay with the team for, several different contracts. But he's earned a lot of money on the court as a Laker, and he's earned a lot of money off the court and, has a bunch of mansions in LA and started a production company, Spring Hill Company. So a lot of pretty strong California ties. And LeBron, would owe something like $60 billion if he can't find a way out of it.
And finally, we come to Beyonce, a prominent Democratic donor. She campaigned for then Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2024 cycle, and Forbes named her a billionaire at the end of 2025. So it's a relatively new title, but the law, like you said, it would come for each of these people equally. How much is Beyonce worth, and what would that mean under this proposal?
Yeah, Beyonce is worth around $1 billion. She's earned that over all of her years of, touring. A good portion of that is tied up in the value of her song catalog, in her writing credits. So she'd owe 5% on that, even though it's, not a liquid asset. She would owe something like $50 million if the bill passes. And you're right, prominent Democratic donor. It doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican alike. The way the bill is written, it comes after everybody, and it's set up so it's not very easy to fight if it passes, and if it can withstand the court scrutiny.
We've just run through a lot of billionaires, but not nearly all of the 246 in California. So, Chase, I have to ask, what will you be watching for next? This has been buzzy news in early January. What are the next steps in the coming days, weeks, or months?
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to see how strongly so many people have come out against it. And I would expect that, we'll see more people, speaking out, and we'll see more people trying to move or saying that they'll move. It'll be interesting to see whether they do. We've seen some prominent names, and there are prominent billionaires who have moved out of California, long before this proposal, and are probably, feeling pretty thankful for that right now. But some of the economists and professors who helped draft the legislation, they think that the concerns that billionaires are going to move out of the state are overblown. They say if you look at the academic literature, it says that people will cause a fuss, they'll threaten to move, but if when push comes to shove, they don't really move. So we've seen a couple prominent people move, but I do think that there are still 250-ish billionaires that haven't moved yet. So I think tracking whether they actually do or don't move will be really, really, really interesting data. And then just tracking to see if it actually gets the signatures that it would need to get on the ballot, and then seeing if it passes. And if it does pass, I think that's when the real fireworks begin, because that's when you're going to see a lot of billionaires pulling out all of the stops to figure out ways to challenge this on constitutional grounds, ways to challenge it on procedural grounds. And then, if those don't work, there will be a lot of individual fights with the government over what their stuff is worth, whether they're citizens of the state at all, and then how do you value a private asset? And, they will do, I'm sure, all that they can if it comes to it to try to lower the value of, everything they can. So it'll be interesting to see.
There could be potentially some lawyer billionaires on the Forbes list in the years to come if this does come to pass, would be my prediction after what you just said.
If it does pass, the state of California, they hope to raise something like $100 billion. And, the billionaires, of course, hope to pay, for the most part, probably as close to $0 as they can. I don't know which of the two sides will really emerge as winners, but I'm pretty sure the billable hours from the lawyers, they're going to get paid either way.
Well, Chase, thank you so much for your reporting. For folks who are interested in reading Chase's story, head to forbes.com. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.